This is Ag Matters PM from the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, brought to you by the Iowa Soybean Association, your source for the latest Iowa ag news headlines right here in the heart of the heartland. With reports from our award-winning team of Dustin Hoffman, Riley Smith, Mark Magnuson, and Andy Peterson. Now, from the IARN studios in Des Moines, here's Dustin.
Well, hello and welcome to Ag Matters PM from the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network. I'm Dustin Huffman. Today is Wednesday, the 5th of February, 2025. So glad you could join us here today. Coming up a little later on the program, we'll visit with Kenan and Layden of agmarket.net to find out what happened in those markets today. But first, we're going to hear from Monte Shaw, Executive Director of the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association, and some of his opening remarks at yesterday's Iowa Renewable Fuel Summit, talking about the future of ethanol, the supply and demand situation we find ourselves in with corn, and what we may have to look for in the future.
I've always thought of myself as a guy who's a glass half full. I'm not Mr. Doom and Gloom. I don't like to be a Chicken Little and just spread bad news, but I am honestly concerned as I travel Iowa and I talk to farmers, I talk to city folk, that I see a divide. Now, ironically, that divide isn't usually between the urban and the rural. Some have suggested to me that it's an age thing. It's the old versus the young. So in farming, where's that line? Like 67, 70 years? Is that the dividing line? Well, seriously, there might be some of that. But really, I think it's a divide between people who think everything is fine and people who think that the foundations of our rural economy are a little bit shaky. And I must admit today that I'm in that latter camp. Now, this might not be a shock to some of you who've been to our last couple of summits. I've talked about this. We've seen it coming. To you, I might sound like a broken record, or maybe that preacher on the street corner, who's always shouting, "The end is near," But as I look at this, governments can put out incentives, they can put out spending programs, they can put out policies, they can be conservative, they can be liberal, they can be populist. They can loudly proclaim that we've entered a new world order, or they can calmly reassure you that we have a new economy now, where the old rules no longer apply. And I think they're all wrong. Okay, I think that any clear-eyed review of history tells us that certain economic rules are as eternal as human nature. We can be loving and caring, but we can also be desirous and selfish. So I don't think any enlightenment or renaissance is ever going to change that. And as long as humans inhabit the earth, some basic economic rules are going to remain carved in stone. And chief among them is supply and demand. I'm a data guy. I love data. It annoys my staff, I know. But if I trust the data, I use it to make decisions. And that's why I'm concerned today. Because I believe the data shows clearly that the ag supply is outpacing ag demand. And I think if you look, it's easy to see. Now, my daughter, senior, is taking a macroeconomics class in high school. So even she knows what happens when supply exceeds demand. Prices go down. So let's look, have they? Well, here's a headline. 2 largest declines in net farm income ever, worse than the 1980s. Even on a percentage basis, you have to go back to the 1930s to find something comparable. Now think about this. Over the last 2 years, net farm income has dropped $90 billion. $90 billion. To put that in comparison, in 2006, the entire net farm income was $100 billion. This is big. The rural lead for the American Bankers Association say bankers feel like, quote, feel like they're looking over the cliff when it comes to the farm economy, as farmers have burned through capital and have started leveraging equity with debt. Now, what happens when farmers don't spend money? Layoffs at John Deere, at AGCO, at Kinsey, at Cargill, Atlantis Co-op, you could go on, even at the Firestone plant in Des Moines where they make tractor tires. Literally thousands and thousands of ag employees have lost their job in just a matter of months. Income is down because prices are down. Why is that? Now, we could look at many different segments, from renewable natural gas to biomass-based diesel, but I know Danelle's coming on after me, so I'm going to focus today on the corn and ethanol side in my remarks. So here's the key. Memorize this slide. For the last 4 decades, corn production has been growing nearly 3 times faster than non-ethanol demand. On average, the U.S. farmers are producing 210 million bushels more each year than the one before. Meanwhile, non-ethanol demand was growing at only 55 million bushels a year. We have a demand problem. In fact, over the next 20 years, this could be a 5 billion bushel demand problem. Now, we've seen this movie before. In the 1980s and 90s, demand lagged production. And what pulled us out of that? Ethanol. Look at this chart. In the year 2000, corn going into ethanol plants was around 500 million bushels. By 2010, 10 years later, that number had grown to 4 billion bushels. That's what changed. And that demand growth did not happen because our leaders were looking to the past. It happened because in the crucible of the farm crisis, we forged a united effort to look forward. A new destination, back then they called it value-added agriculture. You guys remember that in the 80s? That's all I heard growing up as a kid in the 80s was we got to have value-added agriculture. In an effort to escape the farm crisis, we tried everything imaginable that could add value to crops. Some worked, some didn't, but there was one that emerged that not only worked, but was large enough to make a meaningful difference, and that was renewable fuels. If you want to know why 2000 to 2020 was different for rural America than the 80s and 90s, you need to look no further than at this chart of corn use. Starting in Minnesota and spreading throughout the Midwest, ethanol balanced the supply and demand ledger. Demand caught up to, and for a period, kept up with increasing supply. This isn't rocket science. So you might say, why are you concerned now? After all, we're still producing ethanol, aren't we? Well, check out this chart. In 2000, the U.S. produced less than 2 billion gallons of ethanol a year. By 2016, we were at 15 billion gallons a year. Now, 8 years later, we're at 16 billion gallons a year. Clearly, the growth in ethanol has leveled off. Here in Iowa last year, we produced about 350 billion gallons of biodiesel and about 4.6 million gallons of biodiesel and 4.6 billion gallons of ethanol. The thing is, those numbers really haven't changed that much in the last 4 or 5 years, and that's the problem. Roughly 98% of our gasoline in all 50 states is blended with ethanol. We've saturated that market. Now, there has been some growth in exports, and that's good, but it hasn't been enough to keep up with farmer productivity. At the same time, our ethanol plants have become more efficient. Simply put, today we get more gallons of ethanol out of the same bushels of corn. In 2017, we needed 4.4 billion bushels of corn to produce under 16 billion gallons of ethanol. 7 years later, we needed only 4.3 billion bushels of corn to produce over 16 billion gallons. The data is clear. We have re-entered a period where corn supply is greater than demand. And quite frankly, we'd be feeling this impact much more strongly if it weren't for a war in Ukraine and the fact that Mother Nature has been a little subpar with us weather-wise in the last few years. Now, I do know there's been a bump in corn prices and all farm prices recently. And look, my family and most of you, I assume, think that's good. Okay? But Kevin Studer once asked me, do you think praying for a drought in South America is a solid marketing plan? Do you? Now look, I do believe in the power of prayer, but I would rather have sources of new demand to get out of this than count on someone else's misfortune. And the good news is we do have opportunities. We have fuels and fuels of opportunity. So the question before us today is straightforward. Should we ignore the data and just go along as if everything's fine, or should we confront the challenge and unite to find solutions? I submit to you today that the conceit of complacency is our dangerous detour on the American road trip to prosperity. It is not a pothole, it is a cliff without a guardrail. If our desired destination is fuels of opportunity, then we must beware of letting anyone take the wheel who only wants to look in the rearview mirror. And to be fair, the rearview mirror is kind of nice. It's kind of like a siren song. After all, the last 20 years were 20 of the best years in American agriculture. But if we choose to look in the rearview mirror, or if we allow our policy leaders to, history suggests that complacency leads to decay. How do we here avoid that trap of complacency? How do we avoid destroying rural America's future by holding too tightly on to the pleasant scene in our rearview mirror? I would say that it starts by not ignoring the data. Supply is outpacing demand, and it's a bright red flashing light in front of our faces. So what's the solution? Simple, build demand. Of course, as you guys in the room know, it's a lot easier to say build demand than it is to actually do it. So as we look at all the possible demand drivers, what can actually grind up 5 billion bushels of corn over the next 2 decades? I see one thing, I see renewable fuels. But they are not necessarily the same renewable fuels that one sees in the rearview mirror today. Now the good news is that the future fuels of opportunity, they are real, they are reachable, and the fuels of opportunity represent huge new markets that can more than keep up with the growth in ag output. Now, that British example emphasizes the need to avoid bad policies. On the road to the fuels of opportunity, sometimes we're going to need multi-state projects. These projects are often being attacked at the local levels without regard for their statewide and national importance. The rallying cry is often, we need to protect the way things have been. But what is necessary to grow the rural economy over the next 20 years doesn't appear to cross the opponent's minds. We must start thinking with our minds and not just our hearts. Now, this afternoon, we're going to have a great panel that's going to dig into the hows and whys of decarbonizing biofuels. They will look at new markets like sustainable aviation fuel. They will discuss how petroleum and biofuels can and should work together. They will provide insights into new and existing crops that will be able to allow us to make this happen. My theme today is that we need to grow demand. This panel will explain how to get that done on a scale potentially unprecedented in U.S. history. But I will say, we have our work cut out for us. I've been out trying to talk with potential customers and see what they're thinking. The good news is, we have made progress. Appreciation for some of the traditional biofuels is strong. But I think we have some work that remains as we seek to move into new markets like sustainable aviation fuel.
And that was Monte Shaw, Executive Director of the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association. We're going to take a short break and hear from our sponsor, the Iowa Soybean Association and the Soy Checkoff. When we come back, Kenan and Layden of agmarket.net helps us run down the closing numbers. This is Ag Matters PM.
Iowa Soybean Association is driven to deliver for Iowa's 40,000 soybean farmers. We're proud to provide objective agronomic research, a helping hand with soil and water stewardship, and timely industry news powered by the Soybean Checkoff. Learn more at iasoybeans.com.
It's time now for the Ag Matters PM Closing Market Summary, your source for market analysis and settlement prices from the day's trade in Chicago, courtesy of the folks at agmarket.net. We're back on Ag Matters PM from the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, and we're joined right now by Kenan Layden of agmarket.net. And Kenan, what did we see come out of those grain markets today?
Yeah, beans were kind of just a reversal of yesterday. A lot of pressure on the bean market, downside later today. Some news there is the Rosario Grain Exchange came out and said that Argentina, central growing areas had received beneficial rains today and yesterday, and Cape kept their production estimates for 2024, 2025 unchanged. Brazil's harvest seems to be clipping along really well, and from what I've been reading, it sounds like the yields are good out of there. Wheat was also down today. China had canceled some, wheat purchases out of Australia, and there's still the possible tariffs if China and Trump can't come to an agreement. And corn held in there today. Some of the contracts are even traded slightly positive on the day. So corn was probably the one who took all the news today the best.
It was interesting this morning. I was looking at it before the open, between the overnight session and the daytime session. I was like, okay, so soybeans are down about a penny. And then, as you said, I looked at it about a half hour, 45 minutes later, and by golly, it was down like 13. And it seemed like it was taking everything along for the ride. But you said corn was able to reverse its momentum. Kind of what was that positive momentum there?
Yeah, a lot of the contracts are down to even on the day, but it held in there. Some of that could be export demand still just being so strong in that corn contract. And corn doesn't have a giant South American crop that's being harvested right now, competing with it fundamentally. The safrinha crop sounds like it will get planted. But there's some mixed news there on are people worried or not worried about that safrinha crop and competition with U.S. corn on the world stage for export business. Right now corn is just cheap out of the United States and export demand just keeps coming. So that's going to support this corn market. Managed money is long and continues to buy contracts, it seemed, on the last CFTC report.
All right, now moving over to the livestock side of things, we know cattle the last couple of days has had kind of a rough go. I can't believe we're actually saying that. How did it fare today on the marketplace?
Yeah, finally. So I'm talking to you on a good cattle day. So last 2 days were, a little worrying, but cattle were able to move back today. Hogs were also up. However, cutoff values today, from what I heard, were lower. somewhat. So it's not great news. And we'll see what trade did, but trade hasn't been quite as strong on the cash side. For a while there, it seemed like it was just going to go up forever, but have to watch that cash market and see where it leads these cattle. But right now, just a pretty good update in feeders. And well, some years it would have been a very good update, but recently with the volatility, it's just kind of a big trade up and down.
No major news then on either one of them really to help drive that momentum today?
Tariffs are always, the lack of tariffs and extension of tariffs is always good news for those cattle and hog markets, since they're such a big importer of, you know, those meats from the U.S., especially that pork. So pork's just going to eat up this lack of tariff news until it comes in.
All right, Kenan. Well, if folks want to talk about some of their strategies, look at maybe how to protect themselves in some of these more volatile markets, what's the best way for them to get in touch with agmarket.net?
Check us out on the web at eggmarket.net. Look for your broker in your area. And if any of your listeners were down in Nashville with us, thank you guys for coming.
All right. Well, Kenan, thanks so much for the insight. We'll talk to you again real soon.
Thank you, Dustin.
That again was Kenan Layden of agmarket.net. Let's go ahead and take a look at those closing numbers on the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network market screen online at iowaagnet.com. At the close, we saw March corn down 1 1/4 at $4.93 1/4. March beans down 18 cents at $10.57 even. Soybean meal down $5.70 at $3.0830. Soy oil 67 cents lower at $45.09. Chicago wheat down 4 3/4 at $5.72 1/4. Kansas wheat down 3 at $5.91 3/4. Minneapolis spring wheat down 3 1/4 at $6.18 1/2, and oats up 8 1/2 at $3.67 3/4. On the Merc live cattle up $1.72 at $203.60. Feeders up $2.47 at $270.72. Lean hogs up $1.57 at $86.65. Pork cutouts unchanged at $93.20, and Class 3 milk up 8 cents. That's at $20.36. And that's been a check of the closing markets, and that brings us to the end of today's show. You can find all our content online at iowaagnet.com, as well as follow us on Facebook, X, and on our YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon on YouTube so you can be notified each time we put out a new video project. Also, don't forget about the free market podcasts that are available Mondays through Fridays, openings, middays, and closings free of charge to your mobile device to get full analysis. You can also find replays of Ag Matters PM, Iowa Ag Matters, and also our Pods of Potential and Weekend Ag Matters programs, all at iowaagnet.com. For Riley Smith, Mark Magnuson, and Andy Peterson, I'm Dustin Huffman here at the IRN Studios in Des Moines. Thanks for watching. This has been Ag Matters PM.